This podcast contains our own personal views not associated with any organisation. Coronial contains descriptions of death inquests that may be graphic and disturbing to some listeners. Discretion is advised. So welcome to Coronial, guys. Welcome back and thanks for tuning in again. I'm Georgie.
I'm Alice.
And I'm Emma.
So today I'm going to be discussing the case of Barry Purtell and David Lobb. And I wanted to discuss this case as, although it occurred prior to the pandemic in a commercial space, DIY has become very popular over the last couple of years as a pastime activity. And I want to point out that it doesn't come without dangers.
Does anything come without dangers?
No, literally nothing.
If the research isn't about the task is not adequately undertaken, and in some instances a qualified professional may really actually need to be contracted.
Yeah, do not do your own electrical work.
Exactly. And so, look, this one does occur in a hotel, and so it is an industrial space. So they're not entirely DIYing, but I think it did resonate with me for that of like, oh man, I keep seeing all these like excellent videos of people doing these amazing renovations because they've got all this free time during being locked down and whatever. And then I'm like, ooh, I have no skills and I probably shouldn't undertake a lot of those things because it might be dangerous.
Yep.
So the coroner summarised this case as a tragic accident for which the deaths of Mr. Purtell and Mr. Lobb highlighted the dangers of unqualified people doing work that requires qualification. Or at least a solid understanding of the substances and risks involved.
Yeah.
Okay. This inquest focused on the cause of an explosion and the legislative regime for labelling, handling, transportation and storage of gases involved in hotels and this explosion that occurred.
Right.
Now I'm intrigued as to which gas it is.
Yes. It was refrigerant gas, I should clarify.
Liquid nitrogen?
It was a hotel. How many hotels have liquid nitrogen?
I don't know. Fancy ones?
Those ice hotels?
Yeah. Okay, look, fair. So this inquest occurred...
Was it in COVID times, or is that just an analogy you were using?
No, it occurred before COVID.
Okay.
But, like, when I started
it.
reading it, it made me realise, like, in COVID with all these people doing DIY. Okay, so this inquest was released in 2018 with regards to the death of Barry Purtell and David Lobb on the 15th of June 2014. So way before. It occurred at the Rochester Hotel, which is 2 hours north of Melbourne, which was a hotel that had been leased by friends of the deceased and was closing down. And so they were essentially packing up the hotel at the time that this was happening. So the night before, they decided to have a private event marking the closure, for which Mr. Purtell and Mr. Lobb went to. And at that evening, there was a discussion about people coming to assist the subsequent day to move out furniture and various other items of the hotel as they were closing it down. So in the hotel cellar, there was a compressor, which could be accessed via the stairs from the ground level bar of the hotel, or doors which led out to a laneway out of that cellar.
Yeah.
So presumably the ground floor of the hotel, maybe it was on a hill or something, and so when you went into the cellar, there was a door out into the laneway.
Gotcha.
Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So the compressor was responsible for chilling the hotel's cold room, bottle fridge and glass chiller. Mm-hmm. Mr. Purtell and Mr. Lobb were working on removing the compressor, which included cutting or crimping pipes connected to the compressor that contained gas refrigerants when the explosion occurred.
Yeah, this doesn't sound like a good thing to do.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like a good idea.
No, it does not. This happened in the afternoon on the 15th when they had started doing that work. They were in the cellar when an explosion occurred and caused them injury, which resulted in their death. But no one else was in the cellar at the time of the explosion. So only circumstantial evidence and evidence from forensics and other experts was used to identify how the explosion likely occurred.
Yeah.
Were there other people in the hotel at the time?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Mr. Purtell suffered blast injuries to his chest, which led to injuries to his lung. So he ended up with a pneumothorax or an air leak out of his lung contusions, and bruising and bleeding, along with burns to 40 to 50% of his total body surface area.
Wow.
Blast injuries, that's an interesting concept that I've never thought about before. I'm assuming in this particular explosion there wasn't sort of shrapnel and things, it was just...
I think there was a little bit of shrapnel, and that's what caused some of those injuries.
Yep.
But absolutely, yeah, I think it was just the
gas.
explosion happened whilst they were both in the room.
And the force of that.
And the force of that,
Yeah.
along with the flames that also burned them. And then he also had some inhalation injuries. And those injuries were suggested to imply that Mr. Patel was closest to the explosion at the time, versus Mr. Lobb being slightly further away. Mr. Patel was transported to the Rochester Football Oval, where a helicopter could then land and airlift him to Alfred Hospital. But he suffered a cardiac arrest during the flight and was pronounced deceased on arrival. Mr. Lobb suffered severe burns and chemical exposure, and he was also transferred to the Alfred Hospital following his injuries. And he spent 11 days in the intensive care unit before complications occurred, which resulted from blood loss, infection, limb ischemia, organ failure, and subsequent cardiac arrest that led to the decision for cessation of care due to the extent of his injuries, and meaning that ongoing care was futile.
Wow.
So he just had very bad injuries with a very bad run of complications.
Yeah.
Interestingly, when 000 was called, so our emergency service number, was called by another individual helping cleaning in the hotel, that individual described on the phone that they smelt a pungent odour and burning coming from the cellar, which was relevant given this was an explosion in terms of determining the cause. On arrival, firefighters attending used breathing apparatus to inspect the property after the main gas lines had been turned off, and no detectable levels of natural gas were found, as the initial assumption was that the gas leak had arisen from like normal main gas lines.
Oh, right, yeah.
So then during their review, the firefighters came to the conclusion that the ignition source was a cigarette lighter found in the cellar in the context of Mr. Lobb and Mr. Patel removing the compressor. So the assumption was that Mr. Patel lit the cigarette, given he was closest to the explosion. Whilst down in the cellar.
Yeah, that's a poor decision. But also, if you're not trained in any of this stuff, you wouldn't necessarily know that.
Yeah,
that's
so we're
a bad
come,
idea.
We're going to come to a lot of that, yeah.
Really?
I mean,
I thought that was pretty common knowledge not to have an open flame around gas.
but if you
They were
don't
removing
know,
the compressor, and their
Yeah,
understanding
that's
was
true.
that the compressor was not releasing gas,
Yeah.
so they thought they were in a safe environment where it wasn't going to explode.
yeah,
Okay.
For me, like, there's always a question of, like, why you chose to light up in the cellar
yeah,
versus an external area. But I guess if it's
If it's just you and your mate, like,
if it's a pub that's shutting down,
yeah,
Yeah, it
and
doesn't
there's,
really
there's no
matter.
longer a regulation around smoking inside, then whatever.
Yeah.
But
private property at that point.
so a forensic officer of the Fire and Explosions Unit at the Victorian Police Forensic Service Centre, that's a mouthful, reviewed the evidence from the scene and concluded that a flash event had occurred, as no sustained fire had occurred. So the rest of the hotel didn't sustain, ongoing fire and burning. And this suggested that flammable gases had been within the environment. Items recovered from the cellar were analysed at a later date to assess the source of the explosion. And this confirmed the presence of both flammable gas refrigerant and fluorinated refrigerant. There was also a belt grip product located in the cellar, which is a product you can buy from various hardware stores located in the cellar. And this product improves belt traction and reduces tension to reduce stress on motors, and is sold in aerosol cans. And so it was also thought that this could be a small contributor to the explosion as another flammable product in the area where the explosion occurred.
Yeah.
So a bit of background. Mr. Patel was a 34-year-old qualified diesel mechanic. He had 2 children. He resided in the hotel at the time that it was open and was well known to the owners and friends of theirs. He was known to be a heavy smoker and a heavy drinker, whilst Mr. Lobb was 53 years old, so a little bit older, and a boilermaker by trade, and worked as a fitter and truck driver as well, and had 1 child, was also known to be a heavy smoker, regular drinker, and neither have had any known medical problems.
So they were both sort of in trades of some description.
Hence why they were...
Why they felt confident in
That they
doing
could-
this. just not the trade that they necessarily need, because you've got... Yes, there's like refrigeration mechanics.
Yeah, I thought so.
Okay.
But I
So
think there's a bit of overlap between like plumbing, mechanics, and electrician.
So, in terms of the compressor and its maintenance history, wasn't great anyway, let's be honest. So, prior to the lease, it had been serviced by a refrigeration and electrical services business who used a non-flammable gas refrigerant. But following taking over of the lease, it had then been serviced on 2 occasions with another refrigeration business who again used a non-flammable refrigerant and also replaced a valve that was suited to particular refrigerants and will not work with incompatible refrigerants.
Right. Okay.
So if you put the wrong valve in, it will become faulty. However, the fact that it needed so many refrigerant replacements was suggestive that there may have been an associated leak because they were needing to replace it.
Yeah.
But this was kind of managed by continuing to just put more refrigerant in.
Right.
So subsequently, after those services, Mr. Patel was then asked by the lessors of the hotel, his friends, to assist with the compressor as it began icing up. And given that he resided there and had the history of being a diesel mechanic, which involved the use of motor vehicle refrigerants, they incorrectly assumed that it was an equivalent task.
Yeah.
Right.
And he felt comfortable doing that as well.
Yeah, and ultimately he completed the work and it resolved the issue of the compressor icing up.
Mm-hmm.
But in reality, he used refrigerant gas that he sourced from his employer without the knowledge of his employer.
Ooh.
And
Which would have been more for cars or motor vehicles.
Yes, he used a motor vehicle refrigerant.
Yeah.
Yes. And it was determined that the refrigerant used by Mr. Purtell's employer, where he gained the refrigerant, was in fact a flammable gas, and hence likely that's what he put in the hotel's compressor.
Yeah, right.
And so ultimately it was thought that that service, along with lighting the cigarette in the cellar, was what led to the explosion.
Because if he hadn't added that flammable refrigerant, this wouldn't have
Should not have
happened
happened
because it would have been
they were using
non-flammable gas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And hence where it comes into the regulatory. So someone who was trained in that area should have understood to put a non-flammable gas in there.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there was some issues around it already leaking in the first place as well. And so potentially that also should have been identified in terms of ways to fix the gas leak, because either way, gas was leaking.
Yeah.
And they were using non-flammable gas, so
It was okay.
but once it became a flammable gas, then it was less okay. But it doesn't mean you should just let your compressor leak.
Yes.
No.
Not ideal. So further review through the inquest, there was an expert witness that testified that if the compressor had been installed, maintained and decommissioned in compliance with the Australian standards requirements, that the explosion wouldn't have occurred,
Yeah.
which we can't already stated.
Yeah.
And that it's also unlawful to top up a known leaking system. So given that there was believed to be a leak in this one based on its history, even though no one had kind of really identified that so much, that the idea should have been, if you were following Australian standards, that you would fix said leak, much like when that valve was installed, rather than continuing to just top up with refrigerant. And that a leak should be tested and repaired before adding more refrigerant. And then finally, the change from a non-flammable to flammable hydrocarbons. The reason why a flammable gas might have been used by Mr. Patel is that there has been a change from non-flammable to flammable refrigerants, occurring as these are more environmentally appropriate, but then hence require further training and expertise to ensure their safety,
Right.
so that we don't have an increased risk of explosions.
Yeah. That's interesting.
But with these changes, the expert witness also felt that the compressor should have been labelled according to Australian safety standards, warning of flammable gases had it been known that a flammable gas had been installed. Which, again, you can't do if you didn't know that it had flammable gas in the first place. But
Which you sort of would have thought, if he was used to dealing with that sort of gas in a vehicle environment,
you
you think he would have known that it was flammable?
But he didn't know it was leaking.
Also true.
So he was in a space where he thought the compressor was not leaking, so he didn't realise it was okay to... Like, it's that Swiss cheese model of, like...
yeah, and they weren't
all these things
they weren't
lining
like clamping off, because you mentioned before they needed to clamp off.
They had
compressor.
clamped off things and that kind of stuff, but the whole machine was leaking
Yeah,
anyway.
okay.
So realistically, that room. And so the final comment by this expert witness was also him being critical of the fact that the compressor was in such a small space anyway. Whilst it had dual access, there was a lack of space, which meant that that flammable gas could in fact build up as well.
Right. Yeah.
And so had that not happened, again, would have been less likely for it to be built up in that sort of huge explosive blast as well. So again, another one of those points where like this step all needed to have aligned for it to have gotten to that point. And that was what was the hard part. But at the same time, there were a number of steps where that could have been identified. And simple things like labeling if there's flammable in there, getting the right person to do the work, and then it being located in an appropriate location, which I would assume that, you know, it's historical. It's in terms of the compressor was installed there, the hotel might have changed over time or whatever. And so at the time that it was installed, it may have been an appropriate space or had an appropriate ventilation. And then over time, changes have happened without consideration to the compressor. And so essentially, there weren't particularly direct recommendations in this case, given that it was unqualified individuals proceeding with removing this compressor in a manner that ultimately ended up being unsafe. The coroner essentially was saying that
there's not really work safety standards you can put in place
because
there.
they're
and
not
that there is plenty of standards in the refrigeration industry
But this wouldn't have happened if someone qualified
were doing it or shouldn't have happened.
And if
Can't
they,
say
if it
100% wouldn't.
And if it did, there would be disciplinary action they could take. But in this case,
but I mean, again, if it's been serviced inappropriately by the non-qualified individual as well, that's also hard. But did kind of mention that as the industry changes from those non-flammable gases to flammable gases, that there must be highlighting that those mechanics are aware of those changes to make sure that they're aware that flammable gases are being used now.
Yeah.
especially if you've got someone with lots of years of experience that the whole time they've worked, it's been non-flammable, hasn't been an issue, and now it's changed. They need to potentially change the way they work.
Well, even if they know that it's flammable because you're just running through a cycle of things that you've been doing for the last however many years, I can totally see how you might have a lapse because you've forgotten there's been that major change. But yeah, so I mean, I just found this one really interesting out of that concept of highlighting, really considering what you're doing and whether you are qualified, trained, appropriate to do it. If you're painting a wall, probably low risk,
Okay.
all good. But when you start getting into those things that have rules, regulations, and qualified individuals in industries for them, that's the time that you really should be considering making sure that you look for those professionals.
Yeah, and sure, it's going to be cheaper if you do it yourself, but at what cost?
2 lives in this case. So yeah, so that's the case of Mr. Patel and Mr. Lobb.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, thanks everyone for listening, and
be careful around gas and open flames.
Yep.
And things that you might need someone who's trained in that to take care of.
Let a professional do it.
Yeah, or get some advice at least. All right, we'll catch you guys again next time.
See you later, alligators.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.